Hello again, everybody, and I hope that you enjoyed that fantastic conversation between Michael Marmot and Andrew Kelly. I'm now absolutely delighted to introduce Gabriel Scally, who will be familiar to so many of you on this event. We're delighted that Gabriel is here with us. Gabriel is Visiting Professor of Public Health in the University of Bristol. Previously, he was Director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Healthy Urban Environments at UWE Bristol and President of the Royal Society of Medicine's Public Health Section. Other roles have included Regional Director of Public Health in England, Chief Administrative Medical Officer and Director of Public Health in the Eastern Health and Social Services Board, and he is a member of the Governing Council of the World Federation of the Public Health Association. Gabriel, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for inviting me to speak on such an interesting topic as well.
Fantastic.
I'm very pleased to follow on from Michael Marmot because I've known Michael a very long time, since I was a student in the early 80s. And he was kind enough to invite me when he was finalizing his report 11 years ago to chair a working group looking at the implementation of recommendations around the built environment. So I can attest to his commitment to that area, to the importance of the whole area of health in the built environment. But I've been asked to talk about so how do we build health into cities in terms of what happens post-COVID. And I want to start at the very beginning. Can I have the first slide? Thanks. And I'm going right back to the origins of health in the built environment, and the Hippocratic group of corpus of writings, not all done by Hippocrates himself, the father of medicine, but had interesting words to say about environmental aspects of health. And as Greece developed as a trading nation, they were very interested in where they should be establishing and building their ports. And Airs, Waters, Places gave a lot of guidance, some of it quite bizarre, but what was very clear was that they were well aware of issues such as the wind direction, facing the sun, and marshy land, all being aspects that would affect health for good or ill. And in this just little quote, which I thought applied quite nicely to Bristol, but such cities as lie to the west and which are sheltered from winds blowing from the east, and which the hot winds and the cold winds of the north scarcely touch, very true, must necessarily be in a very unhealthy situation. And sometimes when I look out the rain in Bristol, I think that as well. So the interest in the environmental aspects of health are in place for a long time, and the built environment, because this was about where they should build. But I want to deal with some of these things, particularly airs and places. So next slide. And to move on a lot of centuries to the issue of air and ventilation. This is Florence Nightingale's most famous book, Notes on Nursing. And you'll see from the contents page that the very first chapter was about ventilation and warmth. And she was very clear about the importance of good ventilation, as indeed were so many of the doctors and nurses and scientists and engineers, indeed, of the Victorian era. It was a difficult era for medical sciences in particular, because it was on the cusp of the change from the miasmatic theory of disease causation, which was that it was the foul airs arising from corruption of organic material, the rotting of organic material, filling the airs with unhealthiness and somehow affecting people's health, to a bacterial or a microbiological theory of causation. But at the end of the day, the answer to both issues was pretty much the same. It was about cleansing the streets of waste material, of building good sewage supplies, of ventilation, so that the air was pure and clear. And that was very well understood at that time and subsequently. Next. And I picked up along the way things about public health, and some of the things I pick up are these wonderful little manuals from the Boy Scouts. The one on the left, as you're looking at it, from the Boy Scouts of America, 1956, and the other one from England, actually printed and made in Scotland, actually from the UK then, originally from 1939. And these were manuals about public health, and they're really fantastic detail in them, and huge amounts more about ventilation than you would ever find in a public health textbook for professionals these days. So ventilation was, so you couldn't get this badge as a Boy Scout without knowing about ventilation, how, for example, to operate sash windows and other aspects of ventilation. I have no idea what the Girl Guides were taught, because I've been unable to find a Girl Guide equivalent. But at least we know Boy Scouts knew more about ventilation in these past decades than most of the population know, including health professionals now. Next. One of the things where air was seen as being extraordinarily important was in the context of particularly of tuberculosis, which really, there was a pandemic of tuberculosis in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century across these islands. And one of the responses to that was the creation of open air schools. And I just want to snap through some shots of open air schools. But I thought I sort of clipped or photographed this from one of the other bits of material on my shelves. And it's a report from 1917 from the Medical Officer of Educational Health in the city of Nottingham on the effect of their recently opened open-air school. A feature of the Arboretum open-air school, to which I attest the utmost importance, is that it provides, in the midst of a large industrial population, a visible proof of the vital importance in capitals all, young children of pure, fresh air, sufficient rest, and regular wholesome plain food, that these children specially selected by reason of their habitual delicacy, what a lovely phrase, habitual delicacy, should during the length of a winter of such exceptional severity as that of 1916-17 be educated in the open air and not only survive the ordeal, but actually manifest a most astonishing access of health and vigor, should strike a shrewd blow at many of the silly superstitions and superstitions amongst the about the I don't know what that is. I meant the supposed dangers of open windows, night air, east winds, and the like, against which the medical profession has so long contended. So we understood that fresh air was extraordinarily important to health, and particularly to the health of those who were most vulnerable. And open air schools were a real feature of British society and Irish society from the beginning of the 20th century onwards. Next. And we'll just go through some slides. This is one from Belfast, from Greymount School, a school built by an English architect called R.S. Wilshire, and I'll show you one of his other schools later. And you can see the sort of cloistered classroom in underneath the arches there, but on this occasion they've moved all their desks outside. Next. This is from New York, wonderful hoods to keep them warm in a New York winter with the windows open. Next. That's from the early 19th century. From mid-19th century, from the Netherlands, a lovely shot of a classroom with fantastic opening windows at the top there, and then a whole sliding wall that's been opened up. Next. This one from Hull, with, again, a classroom you can see in the background with sliding walls and huge opening windows, and on this occasion, again, outside. Next. And Bristol had a lot of remarkably good open-air schools in Bristol, which operated from 1913 to 1957, the last one closed. So they were right across the place. And this whole idea of building for health and building for air just chimes so well with COVID, which we know, of course, is an airborne disease, even though there's a lot of still confusion about that, people talking about it being droplet spread and having obsessive hygiene theatre, it's called, obsessive cleaning of surfaces. But architecture really changed and building really changed because of infectious disease, because of pandemic flu and the Spanish flu, because of tuberculosis. Next. And this final shot of a school is from my primary school, St. Kevin's Primary School in the Falls Road in Belfast, in the midst of the most impoverished community in the city of Belfast, one of the most impoverished in these islands at the time. And this was built in 1933. And it had, as you can see, very tall classrooms with large numbers of windows. Most of 2 walls were taken up with windows. It had no internal corridors. It was built around open quads. And it faced, this is the frontage of the school, which faced not to the road, but faced south over meadows to catch the sunlight. So this architect, R.S. Wiltshire, who was the city architect for the Education Authority in Belfast in his career, built over 60 schools, all built on this hygienic principles. Of course, that school, fantastic though it was knocked down some years ago and replaced by a closed, air-conditioned box full of indoor corridors and absolutely just not the school in which to have our children go through a pandemic experience. Next. And this is quite interesting. Just over the last few days, this is from the Irish Times on Monday. This is a school which closed in Wicklow because they're really having done very well so far. They had a very big outbreak, and the rules had changed, and contacts of people who tested positive for COVID were no longer having to isolate, and et cetera, et cetera. There's the same sort of stuff happening in schools across these islands. And the headmistress closed the school, Ms. Barrow, and she said the school has cleaned and fogged our school daily, but we've been told by HSA there's little protection against the Delta airborne virus. Well, it's not true that there is little protection. What you can do is you can have HEPA filters, you can have ventilation, you can have air conditioning with filters, you can have masks, and all of that stuff should be going on in schools, but isn't, and yet we still see obsessive cleaning going on. Next. And this is a lovely school. This is a primary school in Wicklow in Ireland, where over the course of one weekend, the parents built this outdoor classroom for children to be in. Next. And modern ideas are popping up all the time, and architects, being dreamers and conceptual thinkers, are thinking really hard, and I'm very impressed by the amount of effort going into thinking of how architecture can keep up with COVID-19 and the potential threat in the future of other similar diseases, which is extremely important. There's no reason why it should take another 100 years for a pandemic, no reason why it should take another year or 10 years. I mean, it could happen at any time that we get another pandemic, even though we haven't finished with this one at all. Next, so interesting classroom there, and this is the World Green Building Council, and they've been putting a lot of effort into safe air in a post-COVID built environment, what that would look like, and it's a real issue for transdisciplinary cooperation between ventilation engineers, for example, between public health people, educationalists, architects, and that whole issue of how we can have safe air. In fact, we have a right under the Health and Safety at Work legislation. It's perfectly clear that employers must provide employees with with adequate supply of fresh or purified air, which I think of regularly when I enter University of Bristol buildings, about the duty of the employer in that regard. Next. But it's not just about air. The lessons of COVID, not just about air. Next. It's also about exercise and physical activity and all that means for people's well-being. We know it means a great deal for people's fitness, and we know it has a lot to do with mental health as well, exercise, but it also has quite an effect on the immune system. Regular activity improves the immune system, tones up the immune system, and has an anti-inflammatory effect. So exercise is really important for all sorts of reasons, and of course, particularly in an era of obesity, and obesity, of course, being a major risk factor. If you happen to get COVID and are obese, you're much more likely to end up in a hospital and indeed die. So that whole issue of obesogenic environments is extraordinarily important and given increased emphasis by COVID. Next. And one of the most remarkable things, I think, was in the early days of COVID during the first serious restrictions, when parks were closed. And this is a lovely picture from, I think it's Brockwell Park in Lambeth, and where they locked the gates in the park because too many people were going into it. And the tone from the local council, ticking off the population. Some people were actually sunbathing and congregating in large groups. This is unacceptable at this time. So the response was to close the parks. Next. So that brought me to thinking, well, where are people going to get out into the fresh air, which is safer, going to get that exercise important for their mental health and their physical health and their immune system? It turned me to thinking about parks, as I had been thinking for a long time about the public realm, particularly seeing some of that public realm degrading, and also seeing some of that public realm being taken over by the private sector, such as the incorporation of streets into shopping districts. And I've been told to get off my bicycle on many occasions, cycling in the centre of Bristol in Cabot Circus, because the roads that used to be public streets aren't public streets; they're private streets now. And you're not allowed to cycle on them. You could only walk on them. And that sort of issue of the public realm, I think, is extremely important. And parks are extremely important. There were no public parks in Britain until the 1840s. There were lots and lots of leisure gardens and other recreation spaces, but they were privately owned or owned by wealthy landowners or the royal family or whatever, but not public parks. And often there were charges to enter these recreation grounds. In fact, I live in Hotwells in Bristol, and I live right beside the piece of land that was the Vauxhall Gardens in Bristol at that time. So parks really came into prominence in the 1840s. And and this report, interestingly, isn't it, that one of the best reports about the state of UK public parks, and they've done a couple of parks, should come from the Heritage Lottery Fund. And that's because the lottery is being turned to as a source of money to maintain parks as budgets have been reduced. And I remember my shock in finding out that, as a director of public health, that leisure services were a discretionary activity of local authorities. They could just shut all leisure facilities if they wanted to. There's no compulsion on local authorities. Next, please. And the report showed very, very clearly how important parks were, with 27,000 parks of green space in the UK, and 57% of the population saying that they used them regularly. But the feeling of all the people that were being surveyed in park management were deeply pessimistic, with 95% of park managers expecting their revenue budget to be cut over the next 3 years. And of course, we know the cuts to local authority, and it's, I suppose, it's rational that they should fall disproportionately on things that are discretionary, things that the council doesn't have to do, are more likely to get be cut. One of the responses to this report next was that one of the select committees, Communities and Local Government Committee, did a report on public parks, which they published in 2017. Actually, one of the difficulties, I think, for the Heritage Lottery Fund was to find out which department or which minister was in charge, because there was no minister to whom it fell naturally. But the CLG committee, perhaps appropriately, picked it up. And it was a terribly disappointing report, because it was full of nice words about how important parks were, but very little in terms of recommendations. And their most substantial recommendation, which I think is a stupid recommendation, placing a statutory duty on local authorities to collaborate with health and well-being boards to prepare and publish joint parks and green space strategies. Now, health and well-being boards are not one of the great successes of the health service reorganisation with the Lansley Bill in 2012. And in fact, I think they're a profound disappointment. They have no funding, they have no powers. They are a collaborative organisation in theory between local authorities and the NHS, but of nugatory value. So we are in a real problem about this, and there is this really difficult issue about who is in charge. Next, please. But the issue is there, and it is amazing, that one of the WHO, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, It's in under number 11 about sustainable cities, and 11.7 by 2030 provide universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons and persons with disabilities. And who is building the parks of the future for our growing cities and towns? Urbanization proceeds apace. Who is providing those? Who is going to fund them in the future? Which was the concern of the Heritage Lottery Fund as budgets continue to be cut. Next. So it's not just about air, and it's not just about physical activity. It's also about how we live our lives, and it's about lives and livelihoods. Next. And this is Princess Victoria Street in Clifton, not far from where I live. And Princess Victoria Street has very controversially, during the course of this pandemic, has been pedestrianised to give more space to some of the shops to spread into the street, and also to make it safer feel much safer for pedestrians using the street, so that they don't have to pass quite so close to each other and be crowded together. And I'm a great advocate of it. I happened to be in Princess Victoria Street before what you see before you, which is much more elaborate now, but was really put into place. And there was tremendous opposition from a very small number of shop owners. And I think my assessment of it is large. It's quite a lot to do with the ability of staff in the shops to park their cars outside the shops for the whole of the day, and while they were at work. But it certainly wasn't helpful to people. Anyway, I was there on this next when the demonstration took place, where they carried a coffin about the death of democracy through the street of Bristol. And ironically, they blocked the traffic with the coffin in order to make their point that blocking the traffic was a bad idea. In fact, it was a great idea. As you can see, people on the streets and perfectly happy, and by and large ignoring the people that blocked it. So it continues, but still opposition from some shops who are attributing their decline in trade. You would think that they might think it could possibly be to do with the pandemic, but no, it's to do with pedestrianisation. Next. On the other hand, Cottam Hill, which has similarly been pedestrianised. This is a pre-pedestrianised photograph, because I think it shows just how sterile the environment was. Has been pedestrianised, and according to particularly to the restaurant cafe owners, it's been a huge lifeline, and indeed it's really quite changed. Typically, of course, and I do say this to shop owners when I'm in with them in Clifton, that all the evidence shows that footfall will increase, and they don't believe the evidence. They just want to see parking outside their doors. Next. So it isn't just air, it isn't just physical activity, it isn't just space, it's all of these things. And I think COVID-19 plays right back into the definition of health of the World Health Organization in the preamble to its constitution. Health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. And I think that's where we are. We're back with that. And we have a real opportunity with the pandemic to do it differently. And we do know things can happen. And my final slide. This is one of the things I learned a lot about New York because during the pandemic, because of their response to the Spanish flu, which hit particularly badly in the States, of course. But one of the things that happened in New York was that there was a new city ordinance about buildings, and the apartment buildings which were built in the post-pandemic era, and I think it still makes up about 70 to 80% of the apartment buildings in New York City, were to be heated by steam. And the reason they were heated by, and still are heated by steam. And the reason why was that it took steam power. Hot water wasn't enough, hot water systems. They had to be steam radiators because they had to be so efficient, because the ordinance mandated that apartment buildings had to be, and dwellings had to be so well heated that it would be possible to inhabit them all winter with the windows open, because they understood the importance of ventilation. They mightn't have understood much about climate change, but they certainly understood ventilation and they understood engineering, and they brought the two together to make the changes. I mean, it is rather difficult now, I'm told, in New York, according to the reports, and people, it makes the apartment blocks far too hot, and there's a nice trade in knitted tea cozies to go over people's radiators to try and cut the heat. But it just shows you what can happen. And maybe the pandemic will produce this great merger of planning and of architecture, of engineering, of community spirit, all of that together to try and change our built environment, which will be healthy for us in all sorts of respects. It's not just about the next pandemic coming along, but it is bringing together all of those aspects of physical, mental, social, and indeed economic well-being. Thank you very much.
That's been fantastic, Gabriel. Thank you so much. And I think that's certainly what this day is hoping to be about, is how can we bring about that merger that brings all of those people together and departments to get together, urban design and health and education. And you've talked so eloquently about that. We've just got a couple of minutes for some questions. And thank you to everyone who's been posting bits in the chat and posting links. Do have an opportunity to read through those. One of the questions I had just from your presentation, Gabriel, was there's been a lot of talk rightly about the negative impacts on children due to the pandemic and all of the unsettled nature of education and home time and stresses and everything else. Could one of the positives be actually a resurgence in the public education of children and families about ventilation and about being able to do things differently outdoors? Is there a glimmer of hope there?
I think so, but it's a difficult situation because it's really interesting. Educational medicine, as it used to be called, was really, really important at one time in Britain. And one of the reasons it was important was because of the Boer War. During the Boer War, it was really difficult to get recruits for the army because so many of them were unfit through chronic disease. Fit young men were not available in the numbers they wanted because of rickets, because of tuberculosis, because of bad eyesight, all sorts of physical problems. So the government, that's what led to the creation of health visiting, of the whole trade of health visiting, lady sanitary inspectors, they were called at one time, but health visitors, and the setting up of children's health services. And the Department of Health only came into being because there was a fight between the local government board and the Ministry of Education about who should control educational medicine and health. And so they sorted out the row by setting up the Ministry of Health. So educational medicine was extraordinarily important. Let me just tell you how bad it's got now. There used to be school doctors, lots of them. I mean, they worked for me at one time when I was working in the Health Social Service Board North. Now, the big staff of community medical staff and nurses and school nurses. And all of that has disappeared, really. And even in the last 10 years, I looked at the beginning of the pandemic because I knew schools were going to be really important. How many school nurses we had? In the whole of England, got 2,000 school nurses now. 10 years ago, when Mike Marmot wrote his report, there were 3,000 school nurses. And if you go back, there were hugely more. One of the things New York did at the very beginning of the pandemic, they said they were going to have a full-time school nurse or a full-time equivalent of school nursing in every school in New York. And they set about recruiting more nurses for those schools. So I would love to think that education would come back into the realm of thinking about health, but we've seen a huge loss in all sorts of respect in terms of the health input into the curriculum, even simple things. Again, thinking of Bristol. My kids went to Hot Wells Primary School. When they went to the primary, when our first child went to the primary school, our first girl went to the primary school, it still had its own tiny little swimming pool in that really small school, in a really poor, what was a really poor bit of the, and that was because kids were drowning in the harbour all the time. And swimming became part of the national curriculum, and all children had to learn to swim, all gone. You know, I think we have completely neglected that whole arena of educational medicine and the health and education of children.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think you're right. It's quite shocking, actually. I mean, I remember my school doctor so well, and actually the idea that infrastructure actually isn't there is quite distressing. So,
and it's one of the reasons why the vaccine rollout program is going so badly for young people. Now, not only the dithering and delay, but we don't have the resources of nurses and school nurses and school doctors to mobilize now to deliver that in schools.
Well, Gabriel, thank you so much. You've set us up for a really interesting day of conversation, and it's great, to, as I say, to see the conversation in the chat. Unfortunately, we've run out of time on this session, but do keep your questions coming, because any that we don't get through today, we can always carry on online on Twitter or in other spaces, and it's useful for us to think about how we might revisit some of those. We've now got a break until 11:15, so do go stretch your legs, go and get some ventilation outdoors, roll your shoulders, get some exercise, get a fresh cup of tea, and we will see you back here at 11:15. But in the meantime, Gabriel Scally, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation.
A pleasure.